Hi, thank you for joining us. Today we are speaking about mediation, specifically in high conflict cases, which includes resist refuse, parent alienation. For many of us, the terms are interchangeable. We know it's parental alienation. We know that there is some resist refuse, although that may be a little different. In my mind, it really doesn't matter. I look at what the tactics are being used, what the behavior is, and is that preventing one parent from having a relationship with the other parent? Is it interfering? And so, no matter what you call it, there is high conflict in these cases. We refer to it as parental alienation. We do refer to resist, refuse, interruption of the parent-child relationship, whatever that looks like. We're going to be talking about how those cases fit into mediation. As I said, my name is Chris Turner. I am a Texas Mediator Credentialing Associated Credential Distinguished Mediator. I've been in practice for many, many years. I am co-founder of Resetting the Family with Dr. Mary Alvarez, which is geared towards early intervention and prevention in families who are exhibiting signs, symptoms, and behaviors associated with parental alienation. I'm also the co-chair with Mary of the PAI Prevention Early Intervention programs at PAI, and we do a monthly, quarterly article in their journal. I train quite a bit in the U.S. And a bit overseas in mediation, including family law, domestic violence, and many child protective services cases. And so I have a breadth of experience here, and I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about mediation, because mediation is used a lot in this day and age, and I think it's becoming more and more prevalent. So today we're going to talk about a basic overview of mediation, the role of the mediator. We're going to talk about mediation in domestic violence cases, which parental alienation is a form of domestic violence. If you've been involved with family access for any length of time, a family is divided, you've probably heard speakers such as Bill Burnett and Jennifer Harmon speak about the data and the studies done on domestic violence and parental alienation. And we'll talk about the times that mediation is used. Many times they're court-ordered cases where mediation is court-ordered for parties, becoming more and more obligatory for parties involved in family law cases. And we'll talk about party-driven, when parties ask for that, both in temporary orders and final orders and requested by the parties. And we'll touch on a little bit of the missteps and pitfalls in mediation that happen with these cases. I want to first make this kind of disclaimer that we are talking about an international organization that's viewing this presentation. And as different as it is internationally, the use of mediation, it also differs from region to region, even within the same state and within jurisdictions. And so the types of mediation that are used, the practices of mediation, although there's an overall umbrella, how they're put into use and how they happen varies differently from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I'll be talking briefly about the overviews of those roles. We know that absent significant pathology, that it's not the family system but rather the system within the litigation that perpetuates parental alienation in families. Part of the major issue with parental alienation in families, specifically involved in law cases, is that it is extended through the litigation system, which often leaves the child or the children with the alienating parent while they're going through this process and identifying. Often, many times, there is not a diagnosis or a finding of parental alienation until the damage has been done to a child, until years through the court system. And so early intervention is really key to helping these families recover early and possibly prevent these things from happening. Again, absent significant pathology. We know that in those cases that have severe parental alienation, there are several diagnoses within the codes that show us a pattern of diagnoses within those parents that are alienating from the target parent. And so outside of that pathology of that parent doing that damage, what can absolutely make the parental alienation worse is the system in litigation if it's not used properly. And mediation is an incredible tool to do that. Mediation can aid a great deal in terms of the balance of power and in terms of saving time. Time is running out on many of these cases. 2, 3, 4 years into a litigation, people are going to mediation at the very end, and time has already gone on, and that relationship has been disturbed with these children. And so we're looking at that balance of power. The other thing that mediation can help is to educate in the litigation and to educate in both the attorneys and the parties about what's going on, as well as to aid the jurisdictions that rule over this in the judiciary over those mediations and those litigation sessions. You understand the role of mediation. You understand that the premise of mediation is to aid the judiciary, to absolutely help the docket of the judges and help them to clear their dockets by getting the parties together so that they can make decisions for their families rather than a third party, a judge, a judiciary, make those decisions for them. These families, our families, all of our families were formed from two parents coming together, having children, and starting those new families. And those people had dreams, aspirations, views of what they wanted for their children. They are the best people at determining what's best for them if parties are working together. And so that was the role that mediation started with. Get the parties together, help them to understand the power that they have to be self-determining about the role of their family and as they redefine their relationship, whether through a divorce or separation, and move into the future to save that child and the relationships within that family while you're redefining the relationships between the parents. We know that the role of mediation has been extremely cost effective in these cases. And so mediation is proposed many times to save time and money. It promotes positive communication, especially early on, when mediation can be utilized early on in a case to set the tone for creating a positive communication between the parties as they work together to redefine their relationship and their relationship with their children. The parties attend in good faith. And this is a very difficult thing to monitor in mediation sometimes, especially when they're high conflict, that the parties are there with the intention of forming an agreement that works for everybody. No one's going to get 100% in mediation, but parties give a little bit. There's some compromise, there's some negotiation, and parties are agreeing to come to the table in mediation with the understanding that they are going to negotiate and compromise. And those are all really good traits of mediation: aiding the judiciary, being cost effective, promoting positive communication, parties attending in good faith with the intention of negotiating and compromising. Unfortunately, what ends up happening in many of these cases of high conflict is the opposite. And we'll talk about that. So let's talk a little bit about the role of the mediator first. The role of the mediator, regardless of what jurisdiction you're in, regardless of what state you're in or jurisdiction overseas, the role of the mediator is a facilitator. It is to facilitate communication between the parties to come to a decision that moves forward, that can be binding in many cases and irrevocable, but to get that understanding, especially in these family law cases, of what's going to happen next with these families. And so that mediator is there as a neutral third party, and they're there to facilitate communication, and they're there to document that agreement. And that everything that happens in mediation is confidential. So that mediator is bound to confidentiality, as well as the parties in confidentiality are bound to confidentiality in that mediation. The mediator's main role, which is very beneficial in these cases of high conflict, is to balance the table, to make sure that parties are heard, that each of them has an opportunity to state what they desire, what they need, what their views are, and to facilitate those communications between those parties, but to make sure that everyone is on equal ground. And there's many tools that mediators, a skilled mediator, can use to do that. So the mediator maintains those roles throughout the mediation. Mediation cannot be used as discovery, and that's one of the pitfalls that happens in high conflict mediations, in high conflict cases. Parties, even attorneys, will use that mediation to gain more information to build their case. Mediation is not to be used as discovery, and that information that's shared in mediation is confidential. It also can't be used to defer criminal action. So if someone has broken the law, if someone has violated a restraining order, if someone has violated one of the premises outside of that family law case, that party cannot agree to drop charges for the purpose of creating agreement among the parties. Unfortunately, many high conflict cases that are handled in mediation are handled poorly. And people leave mediation saying, well, that didn't go so well, or going into mediation possibly for a second time or a third time in the length of a case, saying it's never going to work. And I hear that a lot when people come into mediation or ask for mediation consults. They assume that it's going to be a waste of time because working with that other party is not been beneficial. Communication with that other party has been very aggressive and very acrimonious. They've wasted more time in mediation. They'd rather put it towards the litigation. And in some cases, in these high conflict cases, mediation may be dangerous to a case if it is not used for the purposes it's intended, if it is not kept confidential, if it's used as discovery, if the mediator is not able to balance the table and allow that balance of power, right? The process is the mediators. It is up to them to maintain control of the process and not allow either party, and specifically in these cases, the alienating parent, to take over and ruin that balance of power. So in some cases, it can be dangerous because the mediator cannot maintain that balance. A well-handled mediation will show that a mediator controls that table. A mediator keeps in control and uses those tools to maintain the balance, to make sure everyone is heard, to call an impasse if things are getting out of control or he or she sees that that is not going to happen. A well-handled mediation can really affect the timing of the case. It can help promote things, get parties back together again, maintain relationships with children if mediation is handled well and moves forward, so that the timing of the case between the court case and the mediations and the time that the child is left kind of in limbo in terms of access and possession can be more readily distributed. It can be very well mediation handled very well can really help in the preparation and education of the parties and in preparation of the case moving forward. For example, if a party is involved in mediation and they are lacking some of the basic information that they need, they believe that maybe the alienating parent has some pathology. They believe that the alienating parent has lacked some education and doesn't know that this is hurting their child. Mediation can be used to get an agreement to gain those evaluations or those educational beneficial acts that will help overall in the case. And the mediation can also help greatly, if it's handled well, to get a realistic overview of the case as it moves forward. To be very clear about what's happening in the case and breaking it down into smaller bites rather than waiting for the full hearing. The primary thing in getting a successful mediation is choosing the right mediator for these cases. Mediation varies, as I said, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from country to country, but the mediators have many different styles and models that they use. In the United States, many times that style is the facilitative model, where the mediator is simply a facilitator, encouraging communication between the parties, discovering what needs to happen, and putting some definition on those acts that need to happen. In some areas, a mediator may choose a style that is more evaluative. where they're discussing whether or not the case has its value in court and being clear about that, or more directive. A mediator might use a directive style of mediation where they are pointing towards a certain ending because they can see what's going on in the case and they're able to direct the case towards those mediated agreements. The type of mediation that doesn't work, if you're looking for a mediator in these cases at all, is someone who is only utilizes a facilitative model of communication, of mediation, as well as that model of transformative mediation. And in transformative mediation, and this is used a lot in community mediation, so mediators that are doing a lot of community work, community organization type models, work with parties that are not getting along, that need to identify and build their relationship. They're transforming the relationship between the parties. That is not the goal in the mediation in high conflict family cases. The goal in mediation in high conflict is to set a boundary with those families so that you can move forward, not increase a better relationship between the parties. Because in most of these cases, that will not happen. They may become more civil, but they're not trying to repair and build upon that relationship. The second thing that needs to happen with choosing the right mediator is understanding whether that mediator will use a conference style mediation or whether they'll use a caucus style. The balance of power that happens in domestic violence cases, and we'll speak a little bit more about this later, but I want you to hear this clearly, that model that the mediator uses needs to be able to use both the conference and the caucus style mediation. Parties, if you're trying to balance the table and there is an imbalance of power, such as in a domestic violence, which parental alienation is, if that exists in these families, then having the parties in the same room where that balance of power is observed and you can move into a caucus where parties are in separate rooms is extremely important. Some mediators choose to do just all conference style mediations. And there needs to be time when those parties can have time alone and can caucus and to move into separate rooms and be able to have that private, confidential time where the mediator maintains power over both parties, not just letting one party have more control in that mediation. The second thing that we need to look at in terms of choosing the right mediator is figuring out their knowledge base, getting information about how well that mediator is able to use the tools, whether or not they've had success in dealing with a lot of different types of family cases, and understanding the issues around, specifically about understanding parental alienation and understanding parental alienation as domestic violence, because the rules in dealing with the mediation and domestic violence are somewhat different. We're not trying to create a comprehensive mediation in one room where parties just learn to get along better. Many times there's an imbalance of power that needs to be understood in parental alienation, that the mediator needs to be able to have the understanding of controlling and being able to monitor that and to move the mediation forward. And experience, making sure that the mediator has some experience with parental alienation, with some domestic violence, with understanding children's issues, and has some great experience in the family loss scenario. Most importantly, choosing a mediator that can maintain the balance of power at the mediation table and making sure that people feel heard, understood, and that at the end of the day, the mediated agreement that comes out is balanced and does not favor solely one party or the other, but both parties, their interests are served in some respect. It's important for that mediator to be able to maintain control of the process throughout and not have one party assert their dominance over another party and over the mediator. Mediation can happen at any time during a court case. And people often neglect to understand that not only can they happen when they're court ordered at the beginning of a case in temporary orders or at an emergency hearing, but also in final orders. But parties can also at any time come back to the table and request to come back to mediation and discuss some issues rather than waiting for them to increase in intensity to the point where they end up being a violation of the court order or the court needs to intervene. And so many times in mediation, parties will agree to come back to mediation if something happens or before they file another hearing, before they file another modification of that court hearing. And so it's important that people understand that there are many times, and parties, any party in the case, including an amicus attorney or a guardian for the child, can request people come back to mediation prior to it engaging into such a situation that it's escalated to the point of the judiciary being involved. So let's talk a little bit about those initial hearings. Many times these are temporary orders hearings, and in many jurisdictions, people will be required to go to mediation at the beginning, again, at the request of the judges, to get parties together to work it out before things get worse. To work it out for their family rather than the judge having to decide that. And at any point in a mediation, you can have a full mediated agreement of all of the issues that need to be addressed, or you can have a partial mediation, which still aids the judiciary in taking some of those issues off the table that you agree upon and having the judge make a decision about the issues that you have not gotten an agreement about. But those initial hearings are very important, especially those temporary orders hearings. People tend to think, well, this is just temporary orders. This isn't the final. It doesn't matter. But that temporary orders hearings, as well as the mediations for those, set the tone for what might happen. And people make a lot of mistakes early on in mediation of those temporary orders, early on in those initial hearings mediations, that they can't undo. And so it's really important that you pay attention and be involved in those mediations with as much diligence as you are to the final hearing. So probably the first question that is important to ask in that initial temporary orders hearing is, do you have enough distance? Can you see things objectively? Parties come to mediation sometimes thinking, I just want this to be over. I want to get along with this other party. She would never keep my children from me. She's not going to mess up. He's not going to do something that's going to damage my relationship. And they haven't gotten the distance. When you actually can get some distance between that party and the time that you're separated, and time that possibly you're heading towards a modification or a divorce or a more final agreement about your children, do you have that distance to see things objectively? And that timing of that hearings and of that mediation is very important. You need to be making decisions that are non-emotional and that are based on your ability to see things clearly. We often get involved with people and don't see what has happened until we get away from them, right? It happens in our families, happens in our relationships at work. Many times we look back and go, why did I do that? Why did I let that person do that? Why did I agree to that? Because you weren't seeing clearly. This is the person that you trusted, you had a child with, you encouraged to have a relationship with. Things were going well until they weren't. And now you are the target. And so it's very important that you are able to see clearly there. Many times in these temporary orders, one party has been planning to leave and to take the children, and the other party is totally blindsided. And so they are not in a place where they're thinking clearly. The worst thing you can do is show up to mediation or to a court hearing as a pro se if you are not able to advocate for yourself, because you will agree to things that you cannot undo later. Mediation is about compromise. And so understanding during those mediations what your motivation for that compromise is. Do you understand the pathology of that person that you're up against? Do you understand the way that they work and you can get what you need and they can get what they need and that's workable? Or is that not workable? Is your motivation just not to make it worse or to not make them angry? Not good motivation for compromise. This is your child you're talking about. These are your assets you're talking about in community property. And it's important that you see clearly and that your motivation for compromise is for everyone's best interest, to give a little bit, but not to be taken advantage of. And so understanding and being in a good place at the time of that mediation is important. The timing of that mediation is important. There is a very effective use of mediation early in cases and in those temporary orders to set clear boundaries and to establish a clear, what I call a clear head zone, right? So time that's set apart. So in most jurisdictions, there is a waiting period from the time someone files to the time that that final hearing happens. That's often when that mediation happens. One or two mediations happen, right? And so when that happens, it allows people that time and gives them the time to kind of step away, see things clearly, and get their head clear, right? And it's important that you take some time away from that parent, that other parent that may be destroying or affecting your relationship, not only with them, but with your children. And so get rid of the emotional issues that set you off. Become more aware of your triggers. And so, one of the things that can absolutely help in setting those clear boundaries and establishing that clear head zone is the use of a neutral communication device, such as only communicating about the children through our family wizard or app close or talking parents, or one of those applications that can be agreed to in mediation. That from now on, we're only going to talk about through this just to kind of calm things down. And that can be something that you agree to in mediation that aids in diffusing any of the conflict from building. Another thing that needs to happen in that clear setting of boundaries in mediation is a clear possession and access plan for that child or for those children so that both parties have access to those children. Often parents go in and say, we can agree upon this. And this is before maybe some alienation has started or there's been some anger strikes, but you're not aware of it. But making sure that you're avoiding those as mutually agreed upon time and that there's some backup to if you don't agree upon things. In the absence of any other agreement, you're going to have access to your child every Wednesday night, for dinner, and then every other week, or whatever that looks like. Finding that balance so that it isn't just by mutual agreement. Because if you don't agree, then that child or those children stay with the parent that they're with, and that child will have to choose where they're staying. And so making sure that that's clear and having clear access to communication with the children, setting up that very clearly and early on in a mediation about what those things are and how you're going to see your child, how you're going to communicate with your child. Is that going to be on FaceTime? Is going to be a certain time set apart, and making sure that those default times are not as mutually agreed upon, but those default times, if you don't agree upon the time, are set in stone and you have that. Those are all great things to set up boundaries, but what if they don't work, right? You go back to court, you have to file an enforcement hearing. In your mediation, it's important you establish a pattern of accountability and finding out establishing in that mediation, if things don't happen, what is the default going to happen? The best way to do this is to find a case management professional. I give kudos to people in Israel who have established this in the court system at the beginning of a case where parties who are coming in about family issues are establishing some accountability with a professional in the court system where that case is managed and doesn't escalate. So they have that early intervention early on. Many other places, including the US, don't have that. And so it's important that you find someone that can do that for you, someone that's going to monitor that accountability of the parents and that accessibility about what you agreed upon and making sure that that's happening. Having clearly defined consequences for people who are not maintaining the agreement that you had. What does that look like? What happens? Does possession change? Do you get makeup time if you miss a visitation or miss access to your child? Finding out and being able to mediate what that definitions are in terms of consequences for lost time or lost access to your child, rather than waiting till it gets on the court docket, gets seen before the court for an enforcement hearing, and you're 6 months into it and things have just escalated. Any communication you had with that party has broken down. You haven't seen your child, and they've got unfettered time with that other parent. Really important that that's identified, and you can do that in a mediated agreement, even temporary orders mediation or an interim hearing mediation. That mediation is effectively used early on in cases to create a shift in the power control. There's going to be some pushback, just as there is in domestic violence cases. The hardest time for anyone to get out of a domestic violence situation is when they start to take action. That's when they're most at risk. No different here. The pushback is going to be hard. Expect that pushback when you're setting clear boundaries. And when let that mediator take the pull for that. Let that mediator take control of that mediation, so that both parties are heard, but expect some pushback from that other party. It's going to happen. And that other party may agree to nothing because the mediator is being effective in balancing that control. But an effective mediator will be able to use the skills that they have to make sure that both parties see the benefit of that. Again, if parties are set to not mediate and to not get an agreement, it's not going to happen. But that can be documented as well, that the mediation was attempted and one of the parties was unwilling to mediate or unwilling to move forward. Let's talk a little bit about domestic violence cases a little bit more, because that balance of control is so important. In many places, they do not mediate domestic violence cases. Domestic violence has often been used as a tool to avoid letting parents have access. There's allegations of domestic violence. There may not be proof in terms of the case. There may not be a lot of supporting evidence in that case, but the allegations are there, and we're seeing a rise in those families where domestic violence is especially utilized and alleged in these cases. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. There are cases where domestic violence is an issue, and those cases are more involved with justified estrangement and reunifying that parent more than a parental alienation situation. But is it appropriate to mediate domestic violence cases? Parental alienation is a domestic violence case, right? And has signs of imbalance of power and control, which is indicative of domestic violence. Does the court recognize parental alienation as domestic violence? Many judiciary are not educated on that, and they don't recognize it. And the judiciary is not alone in that. Therapists don't agree on that. Ad litems that may be involved in the case don't recognize it as parental alienation as domestic violence. And so it's important for us to continue to do that education, but to be aware that even in domestic violence cases, mediation can be extremely effective. Parties are in separate rooms. They don't see each other. And the mediator works as the facilitator and the communicator between the parties. And yet they can get a very good agreement that works forward, taking the emotion out of it, taking the relationship between the parties out of it, and focusing on the child. Unfortunately, by the time that an expert witness is involved in the case of parental alienation to talk about domestic violence in parental alienation and parental alienation as domestic violence, possession and access is probably we're 2 years, a year, 2 years into the case, and it's already escalated. So we want to be able to identify that and get a clear understanding from a mediator that they understand parental alienation and can balance that table. Many times attorneys right off the bat or parties right off the bat will say we need to be in separate rooms because they understand that parties, not only is the communication not beneficial, but the power imbalance is so great that they need to be in separate rooms. And a mediator that is skilled will recognize that, take that information, and adhere to those wishes. So the role of the mediator in domestic violence cases may be very different. The control has to be very tight from the mediator. The mediator needs to know initially on what's going on, the dynamics of the family, and be able to see some of that, those dynamics. And so that control is very, very important for that mediator, not only every mediation, but especially in domestic violence cases, because there's less venting that happens. Generally, in a mediation, a mediator will come in and want to hear from both parties about what's going on. There is less venting in those domestic violence cases and parental alienation cases because we don't want people getting caught up and built up in that history again. And we're trying to get to the facts and make that more directive style of questioning. And so those questionings may be very limited to specific information that needs to be shared, very direct information about that, not allowing that party to take control of the conversation, and often in that caucus style. When I think about these directive style of questions that are involved in this imbalance of power, I often think of Judge Judy, and many of you are very familiar with Judge Judy, but she will see someone escalating or some inappropriate pathology going on with a party, and she will ask a specific question and then cut them off and say, answer this one question. And that's what a good mediator will be able to do as well when she recognizes that imbalance of power and the train going off the rails in a mediation, be able to bring them back and ask directive questions. Again, not every mediator will do that. Mediators will tend to listen and be empathetic and try to understand, and that's great if that balance of power is at the table. But when you have issues where, especially in parental alienation and domestic violence, where there is that imbalance of power, it's very important that that mediator take control and move the mediation forward, get towards that agreement for both parties that is going to be balanced by asking directive questions and not letting people vent unfettered. So some of the pitfalls that might happen in mediation that you need to be very, very aware of, especially if things happen early on in mediation, temporary orders, or if there's a modification in your order to mediation, we get concessions regarding your culpability. So in mediation, the concern of any stage of a mediation is what has happened that brought us here today, and what would you like to see? We don't need to hear about the long history unless it has some background that maybe you need to hear. This has been a parental alienation case that's been building. I thought it was okay to have a standard possession, but we're having issues now. We have to go back to modifying it because I'm not getting access with my child. And so being aware of some of that is important to the mediator, but not spending a great deal of time talking about that. And having that history, but not letting that rule why you're here today and where we're moving forward from, right? And so sometimes there have been some concessions in the past from one party, very often the target parent, that leads you to feel guilty or there's some culpability there. For example, leaving the home, right? So a parent that was tired of all of the stress involved and the anger and saw some of this erratic behavior coming and saw the children being used and the stress it was having on the child, decided to leave, and that was used against them. Agreeing to get help, agreeing to, for the sake of pacifying that other party. Sometimes in mediation, parties will agree to do things that they might not have. She says, I have an anger management problem. I'm not going to deal with that. I'll just go get anger management classes. Well, unfortunately, that may come back to bite you. If you agree to that in a mediation and there really isn't a reason for that, then what ends up happening is that becomes part of the case file, right? That agreement is entered into the court. It's enforceable. And what ends up happening is that somewhere down the line, someone will say, you have a history of anger management. You agree to this. Really significantly, I see more and more parents agreeing to supervised visitation with their children when supervised visitation is not necessary, but it is the only way they're going to get access to their child. So they agree in mediation to a supervised visitation with their children so that they can just see their children. They want to see their children and they haven't been able to. And so seeing them even in a supervised setting with a parent there or a friend of the family or a supervised visitation site is better than not seeing the child at all. But agreeing to that early on is not a good idea. And that's a pitfall that I see in mediations that happens all the time as these cases build. Then what ends up happening is that that's documented, and yes, you're seeing your child, and yes, they're seeing that you're not hurting your child during that supervised visitation, but it's harder to undo what you've agreed to do. Not that the court ordered it, but you agreed that you needed supervised visitation. So if that issue is the one issue that needs to be decided, let the court make that. Let them have a case for why you need supervised but don't agree to something that you're going to have a harder time undoing, because that's setting yourself up for later. Buying into the gaslighting. So I want to talk about mental health when I talk about this a little bit. What I see many times in mediation when people come in and they are at the beginning of a case or even in the middle of a case where they've agreed to come to mediation and the power imbalance is still there, and a party maybe had acted badly and they are, as a result of what's happened in their family, they are not feeling like themselves. They are depressed. They might be drinking more than they had to, no one has to, drinking more than they should. They may be using marijuana or other drugs, illegal drugs that are not helping them, and creating more ease for them. It may be helping them get through the situation, but not helping them. And so they buy a little bit into the gaslighting because they feel guilty about some of the choices they've made. They haven't taken care of themselves. They haven't made some good choices. And so when that other party says that they're always involved in that stuff or they've had difficulty, they're able to say, yeah, I have some responsibility for that. And that gaslighting turns into a guilt trip on the parent who's been targeted. And it's really important to avoid that and to not get into that in mediation, and to make sure that you are taking care of yourself ongoing and that you are able to advocate when you are in mediation for yourself and have a voice at the table. Another big pitfall is making concessions regarding your children, time and access. Parents should go into mediation at any point in the game with the primary consideration of their children and having equal time. We know from the research very clearly that it is important, as long as they have a healthy and safe relationship with those parents, to have relationships with both parents, and that time and access are more important than anything that has to happen regarding the community property, regarding other things. And so making sure that you do not make concessions regarding what you think is appropriate for your child, and that time and access, and not requiring or going overboard about limiting that other parents because they're acting badly towards you, that they should have less time with their child or children and access. Making sure that those children have a safe environment moving forward to have healthy relationships with both parents, and setting up agreements in mediation that do that, not allowing for concessions on either side regarding, your culpability and agreeing to get help, buying into someone else's gaslighting, or being variable about your time and access with your children. Very important to remember. At some point in the game, parents start to feel some guilt about what the actions they've taken out of frustration. Remember, when you go to mediation, your goal there is to address the issues that are before the court right now. And so those things that happen, a good mediator won't spend a lot of time talking about what's happened in the past and those actions of frustration. It's important that you take responsibility. If you made decisions, if you did have an anger outburst, if you did leave the house and didn't come home for, a day, if something happened, actions from when you're on the rope's edge are very important to acknowledge, and to make sure you're taking responsibility, and to say, yes, that happened in the past, but that's not where I am now. I was angry at that time, but let's talk about where we are today. Let's talk about what's happening today. I'm in a great place. I've had some distance. I'm thinking, I'm moving forward. And whether you say that to the mediator, whether you say that to your attorney, not to the other party necessarily, but making sure that you're clear about, this is where we're moving forward today, and that is not a pattern. Because I always say that people in the middle of a divorce or a separation, especially when there are children involved, they're not the same person that they were either before that or after that. There's going to be some growth change, right? And people often feel some sense of relief when they get that distance, get back on their feet, that they realize how unhealthy maybe that situation was, and how much better it is for their children to be able to look back and say, you have two healthy parents now. So make sure that if you made those decisions that were not appropriate, that you take responsibility for those and make amends for those, and make sure that your children see a healthy person in front of them in terms of you taking care of yourself and being the best parent and person you can be for them moving forward. Apologies aren't always appropriate, but redirection may be. Yes, I understand that that was a concern in the past, but this is where we are now. Mediation is about the future, not the past. Be clear about what is happening and what is acceptable now for your child moving forward. And for those of you that have had that instance where possibly you made decisions that led you to have some sort of break with your children that is more appropriate to call resist refuse or to have reunification therapy, maybe you had an incarceration, maybe you had a drug addiction, maybe you had something going on, a domestic violence issue that was founded. Make that correction and talk about what's going on now and how you're going to protect. It's important that everyone at the mediation table come there with the intention of moving forward. And resetting, refocusing, and restarting are very important. That's the benefit of mediation, is helping people to get refocused. This is, we're moving from one phase here into another phase. What are the groundwork that we need to set in? And mediation can help you do that. Be aware that action sometimes against the other parent may be construed as action against the family unit and against your children. So if a party A, has the children living at the home with them and you leave, that is going to be construed by that party as you left the family. And so making sure that that's there and addressing that, having that ability to say, yes, I understand that but I did this for the children and this is what's happening. And making sure your children understand, I am healthier and your mom is in a better place, or your dad is in a better place at the house with you when I'm, separated, and that we get some distance. And making sure that they understand that the priority is your children and that it's not something that happens between the parents is very different from what happens to the family and what happens to your children. It's not an action against your children. It might be a distancing from that parent, and that needs to be very clear. The main goal of temporary orders mediation in cases or prior to that final order is to making sure in those parental alienation that you have consistent access to your children. That should be the goal. And it's important to make sure that that's addressed. That should be your priority. So define what is most important to you going into mediation. What's the access that you want for your children? What is the minimum? What's the maximum? And all of those other issues that come up, if they are important, are they secondary to your access to your children? Is being able to be at the soccer game more important or as important as being able to have every week transition of having a week with your child? Is being able to enroll them in a certain activity that you would like to do with them more important than being able to have 2 hours to go to dinner with them, on a weekday, on the other parent's possessory time? Making sure that you're clear about what that is. Your priority going into any mediation involving children should be your access, your visitation with your child, and making sure that you're maintaining that so that parental alienation cannot escalate. Keeping that ongoing regular communication with your child. Define the tools in those mediations on accountable communication. Define what tools you're going to be used to making sure that the communication about your children and for your children is documented and is accountable. The best way to do that is through one of those apps I spoke of, our Family Wizard, Talking Parents, Parent app, making sure, App Close, making sure that you have those communications set up so that you're really clear about what information is sent to you and what information is sent to the other parent. Maintain emotional distance from the other parent for the purpose of clarity. That emotional distance is not to push that other parent out. That emotional distance is for you to regroup and for them to regroup and put the focus on the child and not on the relationship between the two of you. When all is said and done, after a divorce, whatever happens post-divorce with modification is going to affect your children. It's not going to be about what you gave up, what was involved in the marital assets, what happened with all of that. What's going to be the focus of all of that is your children, and it should be. The best interest of the child always has to be upheld in these judicial cases. If at all possible, create methodology for your accountability. Figure out a way to document and have that ongoing methodology from the very beginning, so that as a case starts, if you suspect, you've seen that glimmer, maybe things are going okay now, you know she's gotten very controlling or he's gotten very controlling since you filed or since he filed or she filed the case, making sure that you set that up, get some distance, be clear-headed, try to take the emotion out of that, get help if you need it from a therapist to take that emotion out so that you can deal with this as a business decision regarding your children. That relationship is what needs to be maintained. And so making sure that you're not bogged down in all of the other issues that come up, possibly in mediation, about, assets and, things that you have and houses and, pictures, but about your child. That should be the primary focus so that it's not lost, and creating a way to maintain that it's accountable, that is documentable, and that has some clear consequences set in place. Often after these cases, those modifications, they get through mediation, things start going well. They maybe have a divorce decree that's the basis of that that was based on that mediation that you all agreed, but then people are not following through and things have escalated. You've gotten that emotional distance, which is probably going to offset some more red flags and some anger for that other parent if they have not done the same. If both parents are able to get that emotional distance, that's great. They're able to take their corners and move on with their life. But if one parent hasn't and they still want to get back at that other parent, that's when we see a lot of those parental alienation tactics being used. You need to decide what your hill is that you're going to die on. What is worth it and what isn't. That hill you're dying on is access and possession of your child. You will not compromise on that. And so making sure that you understand that your ability to take care of the child is clear, your stability to take care of the child is clear, that your right to take care of your child is clear, and that your access needs to be there. Can you use in modifications with that ongoing litigation, if there's been a modification post-divorce, can you use that knowledge about the aid to the aid of your case for your children's benefit? Is there something that's happened? Have you documented and kept that knowledge? Do you know information about that other parent that can be beneficial, not to get the other parent, but to help your child, to make sure that your child has a relationship with both parents so that other parent isn't using your child as a tool? Is parental alienation suspected when you have that modification? We've seen a pattern of parents that have multiple modifications in court over a short period of time, talking 2 years, 3 or 4 modifications. They are on the route to parental alienation. There's something going on there. They're consistently trying to get back at that other parent. And more times than not, they're using that child to do it. So how do you prevent that for future damage? You intervene early, you identify it early, you prevent it, and you prevent escalation. So being aware of what that other person is doing, getting those things in place that can help you maintain that, and identifying it as parental alienation. And this is where we have not done a great job in our systems everywhere with identifying things early on and intervening early on. So things may have been going very, very well for a while, and all of a sudden you got remarried, he got remarried, she got remarried, and it set off a lot of triggers that has instigated some of that pathology again. And now your child is being used as a tool against you, and you're not getting the access, you're not getting the information that you need. There might be a lot of behavioral things. They may be talking badly about you. There might be negative talk about you. They might start talking to you as in your first name, by your first name. They might tell you things that they have knowledge of that they shouldn't have knowledge of. And so really important that you intervene as early as you see some of those things and start documenting them. Unfortunately, many times we don't get people involved who can document this parental alienation until later on in the case. And many times it's 2 or 3 years down the road when a severe intervention is needed because the escalation has gotten to the point of severe alienation. So we can further identify those cases at that time. When it comes back to modification, our evaluations, can you agree in a mediated agreement to have an evaluation done? Again, is the expense worth your time to maintain a relationship with your child? If you know that there is something going on with that other parent that you think is documentable, that you think is pathological, get those evaluations agreed to in mediation, without sending that person off, having taken the emotion out of it, just saying, I'd be willing to do an evaluation if she will. I'd be willing to do it if he will. And many times that can be agreed upon. And if there's not a lot of anger behind that or a lot of emotion behind that, parties can agree to that in mediation. They can agree to have a parenting facilitator involved. One of the caveats I want to mention here is that in the US, in the Texas code specifically, parental facilitation is in the Texas civil code under the family law, that it is not appropriate in domestic violence cases. Does the court recognize parental alienation as domestic violence? Generally not. Some judges do see that and they do recognize that, but they're well educated on this. That is not the norm. Can you agree to an ad litem for the children? If you are concerned about that happening and you see that someone is interfering with your time, can the two of you agree in mediation to have an ad litem for the child identified? And you want to make sure that that ad litem or that parental facilitator understands parental alienation. And so making sure you're choosing someone who has a background in that and has some knowledge of that and believes in that. There are professionals in the field that do not believe in parental alienation. And so making sure that they have some experience and that they do believe that that can happen. And here's where that case manager that we talked about a long time ago can really help. If there's been a case manager that's been involved in this, they can provide those resources. Not only can they provide those resources, but they can also communicate with those resources to let them know what's going on in the case and what's been happening so that that can happen in a timely manner. Again, those case managers are neutral, but they are able to testify in the court, which a mediator is not. And they've got some continuity and consistency with a case that is beneficial to all the parties. And so understanding that you can find that case manager as a consistent, continuous neutral that can monitor that case, especially as you see it escalating, that they can provide reports back to the court that are based on what they have seen, based on behaviors and documentable consequences and interactions between the parties. Can you agree upon consistency in mediators? Can you agree to come back to mediation prior to filing anything more? And agree to have that mediator that you've used, that you have had success with, be the mediator on the next case, on the next time around. So they provide some consistency with your case without having to start all over again about what's happened in this case. Very, very frustrating for parties involved to have to start from square one with a new evaluation, with a new mediator, with a new lawyer, with a new facilitator. So if there's some consistency that's able to be happening with that case from the initiation, that is very, very beneficial. Let's look at why that's so important. And so some of the data that we had through Resetting the Family, we had a diversion program. And we compared that information. So what happened with that was similar to a case management model, where parties who had gone back to modification, where maybe they had been divorced or separated, or they had the initial hearing and things were fine, maybe for a period of time, and now they're coming back for modifications and the case is escalating again. We got involved. We had case management or a case manager was assigned to follow that case and intervene. Parties would check in with that case manager on a monthly basis and touch base and how are things going, what issues have come up, what do we need to talk about, and get those things resolved prior to anything escalating more. And what we found is in those mild and moderate cases, 85% of those cases did not go back to court. And so they were able to work things out again. Now, again, we know from the documentation that in those cases and was upheld in these cases, we found there was noted pathology in those cases that did go back and had continuation in the diversion program did not work, and that accountability did not work. The other thing that happens is when you're done with that court case, if it's based in the court system and there's a case manager through that court system, and no follow-up once the court is no longer involved, things escalate again. So is there someone that can be ongoing monitoring at will by the parties to maintain that? Or can you get documentation through that case management that regardless of what happened, things were not held, consequences were not followed through on, and the party that was escalating is having difficulty, and that can be reportable to the court. And so we compared those cases to pro se cases, cases where people represent themselves. Because the question that came up was, what's the difference between these cases when parties have decided that they're going to get along well and they're going to work it out for their children's best interest, which is what I see a lot in pro se cases. It's not so much about the money. It's about, we do not want to destroy our family and destroy our relationships in the family. So we'd rather not have attorneys involved. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's what's been reported in my cases with pro se. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have an attorney, but when parties choose not to, we found that the average length of a case was very short, that their refiling in these cases was very minimal. It was at 8% in a 3-year period. And they refiled basically, with the exception of one case, they were only refiling for support enforcement, right? So it had to do with child support had changed. There was an offset that needed to be changed in terms of the attorney generals. And that in those cases, things did not escalate. So those mild cases, once they got some early education and intervention by a case manager, they were being followed. There was some accountability. They got education about what this is doing to their children. Both in the diversion program and in those pro se cases, they stopped doing what they were doing that was causing those alienating behaviors to exist. They stopped talking badly about the other parent. They stopped intervening on the other parent's time. They stopped behaviors that caused that child to have to choose because they learned about it. And we know that parents that are healthy don't want to actively hurt their children. So having the education about what this does to your child is an important piece of that early intervention. You can agree to that in mediation, and that early intervention can be found in mediation. The role of the attorney is also important. Choose an attorney in mediation that's going to be there with you, that can advocate for you, can calm you down, can take the emotion out of it. Very beneficial. And so understanding that some attorneys are knowledgeable about parental alienation as well. Is that attorney hurting the process or helping the process? Making sure you're clear about that. So early in the case, make amends. Make amends about what you've done that needs to be corrected, and you're on the right path, or making sure that you're setting that relationship. This is about our children. I care about you. I want us to parent together. Not having enough distance can be a pitfall early on in the case. Being blindsided, get that distance. If you were blindsided and you're still not back to a place where you're seeing things clearly, don't go to mediation yet. Wait for the mediation, go in with an advocate where the attorney can advocate for you and in your best interest. And don't allow that early person to manipulate that process in mediation. Very important. Later in the case, mediation may be less effective because parental alienation has a hold. Relationships need to be repaired. And so in the best interest of a child, probably what you're looking at, if parental alienation is entrenched, if it's on the moderate to severe level, a court needs to decide if there's change in custody, and parties generally will not agree to that in mediation. But there can be continuity among all the team members, and other things can be decided in mediation. But generally, mediation late in the case where parental alienation is entrenched is not as effective because it's about access and possibly changing custody if it's a severe case. Understanding that the roles of third parties in mediation are very important. Are those third parties, whether they are significant others, new husbands, new wives, step-parents, grandparents, are they appropriate? Unless parties agree in mediation, both parties agree, and their attorneys, that those people can be in mediation, if they are not a party in the mediation, they are not allowed. And so a grandparent that's intervening positively or negatively can have a huge impact on these cases of high conflict when it comes to access to the children. And so making sure that mediation stays between the parties. And if you believe that those third parties are negative influences in terms of balancing the table and negative influences in terms of what's best for your child and your children's relationship with both parents, don't allow them to come into the mediation. If you believe they're able to help, that's an important factor to note as well. So making sure as we move through mediation, making sure that we have some accountability in those mediations, that we are very clear on what we can prove versus what we can't prove. So allegations that are made happened, right? But what is actually going to be able to help you in court and what is not? Making up for early concessions, right? Don't agree to things because you acted badly in the past. This is a new day. You have a clearer head. If you have deteriorated, that's a huge pitfall that you make in mediation. You're coming into mediation from a point of view where you're not yourself, you are not taking care of yourself, and you are becoming the person that other parent has said you were. You're doing too much of the wrong thing. Allowing the distancing to continue with your children, not getting some concession of some time versus what you need. It should be a balance where they are able to maintain a good relationship with both children. Are you addicted to conflict? Some parents don't do well in mediation because that power imbalance is so great, or they are equally in power in that mediation and the mediator is not in power in that mediation because they're so addicted to conflict, they set each other up all the time. So making sure that you have that distance and that you are not subject to falling back into those pitfalls. Another mistake that happens in mediation that needs to stop early on in mediation is if you start to see yourself revert to patterns of behavior with that other party that are not healthy and that are not helping your case. Make sure you get off and get onto separate rooms and that you're not having to face that person if you are not able to advocate for yourself in front of that person. That power imbalance can continue. You may fall into negative attributes, whether they are you initiating them or the other party initiating them. That happen. Make sure you get a break so that you can think clearly and make those decisions without reverting to those bad behaviors. I want to just spend just a minute talking about allegations and mediation. So a mediator has the responsibility to stop a mediation and to report any abuse to children, elderly, or disabled. And this happens a lot in these cases of parental alienation. And it's not the mediator's decision whether or not that has happened, but whether or not it is being alleged, right? So if there's an allegation of that happening, the mediator has to stop and go forward. Now, if that's happened in the past and been addressed, or if there's a protective order in place already and you're coming to mediation, that's been addressed. But be aware that a mediator will need to do that only to stop. And that all those threats, an allegation of domestic violence, mediation moves forward as long as the balance of power can continue at the mediation table. The bottom line is this: mediation can be a very effective tool. Choose an effective, knowledgeable mediator. Make sure that your emotional responses to that other party or to that other party's words or actions are hindered either by your attorney, either by distance that you've gotten from them. Have a case management game plan. Figure out from the very beginning, how is this going to be to move forward in the courts, through the litigation? Who is going to be the continuous person? How do we get them? How do we get them agreed to in mediation? Come to mediation with the ability to maintain continuity of information, right? Making sure that there's that consistency throughout your case so that you're not starting over every time you go to court. And be prepared. Don't take mediation lightly as something that happens. Oh, this is just temporary orders mediation. This is just mediation. This isn't the final order. Mediation sets the tone many times for what happens in temporary orders, that happens in final. But mediation, if it's agreed upon, is binding and irrevocable in most cases. And so that can be entered and set as a court order. So be aware that the decisions and the things you say in mediation that you write down and agree to can be moved forward to the court hearing and can be ruled on, right? Things that happen in mediation that you don't agree to, things that you say, yes, but I'm not going to agree to that. I agree what she's saying but I'm not going to agree to action about that, are not admissible. That is confidential information and that cannot be used. So utilize mediation as you can, either the beginning of the case Temporary orders before the final hearing, in most cases, those things will be ordered. But at any point in the case where you feel like you need an intervener to help get the case back on track, or things are not happening that should, or you need more definition, you can call a mediation. And so be aware that your primary interest in those mediations should be maintaining access of both parents to that child in a healthy manner. Thank you.